Culture is filled with moments of defiance, of intentional contrasting and difference. These movements defy social norms. They dress strangely, often with garments that they make or modify on their own. They reject traditional power structures. They're often free-thinking young people with neon hair, sharing indie zines and underground music. Their parents might think this counterculture weird or even dangerous. Certainly not something a stand-up citizen would take part in, but for those involved, it helps them define who they are and challenge the more stifling aspects of polite society. I'm talking, of course, about the furry fandom. Punks are staunchly anti-authoritarian, celebrate do-it-yourself work ethic, spurn conformity, and are ever wary of its creators selling out. Furries embrace very similar values. I'm your host, Arrkay, and the parallels of punk and furry are culturally effed. You're probably familiar with punk as a music genre first and foremost, or maybe your elders called you a punk when you've done something that they think is inappropriate. Allow me to give you a brief primer on punk. If you're interested, I encourage you to do more research on punk's decades of history, not to mention music. We've put some links to get started down in the description. Please do your own research because it's fascinating. Punk as a music genre started in the UK in the 1960s as small garage rock, with influences from surf rock and reggae. It developed into a counterculture movement throughout the 1970s, rejected by mainstream rock musicians of the time. This rejection of and by the mainstream meant that these rockers valued do-it-yourself attitude when it came to music production, distribution, and marketing. You didn't need the skill to play, just the passion was enough. It built an aesthetic of raw, no-nonsense rock music, and cheap, easily reproducible iconography of posters, album covers, t-shirts, and zines. It was kept cheap because many of these proto-punks were lower class, and brought to their music thoughts of anti-establishment, anti-authoritarianism, anti-government, not selling out, and direct action protest. This would of course change and evolve as the genre was eventually accepted into mainstream rock, and bigger, more influential bands took the punk mantle and toured the world. In 1976, we have influential bands heading the movement, such as the Sex Pistols and The Clash in the UK, and the Ramones in New York. The 1980s saw the genres expand and diversify into new subgenres, like hard punk, post-punk, noise rock, and anarcho-punk, just to name a few. But even then, it was still considered alternative and somewhat underground in comparison to the pop and rock groups of the time. By the 1990s, we get pop-punk, which, with its higher production values and radio-safe themes, seems to contradict the anti-establishment values of the genre's founders, though even this offshoot retains the look, sound, and defiant tone of punk. But there's still just as much room in punk for the startup noise bands performing in small venues. At its roots, punk has its own philosophy, its own ideals and ethics. Not only was it a rejection of mainstream pop, it was also a more rugged reaction to flower child hippies of the era. Punk prized hard work and making it happen on a dime. Don't have a record label? Make your own. Don't have distribution? Record your own tapes. Don't have artwork? Photocopy something simple with your show date. Don't have a venue? Do a show somewhere that doesn't usually host music. Don't have merch? Cut up and screen print your own shirts. Get it done, make it happen, even if you don't have all the means.
The face of the modern punk. An ugly face to some, but what an eloquent and creative group of individuals they are. What they lack in grey matter between the ears, they make up for in colour on top.
I took this mentality to heart with my own work. Culturally Effed was built on a $0 budget. I borrowed a camera to record the early episodes, and I used pirated software to edit. It's both constraining and liberating, knowing you can meet a goal or make a thing with some hard work and a few cut corners. But it's also all my own work, which means I can go back and fix things or remake them when I have the better means. Even Rusty Shacklefur, our beloved mascot, was made mostly with materials I had on hand. This DIY attitude is especially evident with Boomer the dog and his paper fursuit Papy, in this excerpt from the novel by Joe Strike, Furry Nation. When I went to a convention in Papy for the first time, it got a good reception, better than I anticipated. I thought it would be a funny take on a suit to other furs, but many people thought it was a clever idea. The difference from what other furs have is part of the story, a DIY punk rock ethic. I did it on the cheap, and it's like no other costume. I like that it could be considered trash materials, while at the same time, to me, it's worth $1 million for all of the fun, connections, and goodwill it's generated. Furry takes this punk DIY philosophy to even greater heights. We didn't always have a fandom. What started as a word-of-mouth hotel room parties at sci-fi cons became their own conventions. Small at first, but now attendance is breaking the thousands, and the fandom is getting attention from local city tourism boards. Did you think that letters from the mayor just appeared in the con book? We barely had a fandom when we started holding conventions, but the hard work of a few fostered that growth into the movement it is today.
The face of the modern punk. An ugly face to some, but what an eloquent and creative group of individuals they are. What they lack in grey matter between the ears, they make up for in colour on top.
Furries operate independently of the mainstream fandoms in that those fandoms are mostly based on content provided by a big company. Whether that's Marvel or DC Comics, anime or movie studios, most major fandoms surround these giants of industry and celebrate their works. Furries, on the other paw, mostly celebrate our own works, our own artwork, our own comics, and YouTube channels. Of course, we also celebrate the works of Disney, Studio Ghibli, and more, but those are added bonuses on the periphery. The real meat and sauce of the fandom is fandom made. We're self-sustaining in that way. All furries are creators, every single one. Even if they lack the skills, they contribute their ideas and their imagination. There is no central canon that furries ascribe to, no one piece of media that we all look towards. We roleplay, we draw art, we discuss the weird ways animal people might behave. We create fanfiction, comics, animations, 3D sculptures, and models. We sew ears and tails and whole costumes. At a con, you'll also find soaps, teas, hot sauces, jewelry, and all sorts of weird merch other than artwork. Not everyone is skilled with artwork or sewing, but there's room there for commerce. We commission artists to make our wildest dreams come true, from bringing our strange creations to life to making erotic art of our animal personas. Just like punk, passion speaks louder than skill. Passion is what furries love. Punk is anti a lot of things, so it pulls into question many of society's norms. The body was considered a symbol of opposition, and used to express things that were abnormal on purpose. Androgynous hair, fishnets for everybody, gender for nobody. Drag and general cross-dressing for both genders found a home in punk long before pop music. Punk is a space for everyone to be themselves, and women to be on an equal playing field with men.
With names like Bumbox, Scumbag, and Animal, you can imagine the very special aroma in here. But the cozy sleeping arrangements seem to have some advantages in their eyes.
Just like furry, punk has a history of being incredibly sexually open, flaunting kinks as fashion, putting explicit gay porn on t-shirts, influenced by drag queens like the Great Divine. The activist and designer Vivienne Westwood had a punk fashion store simply called Sex, where you could buy a gay cowboy t-shirt or a rubber corset. BDSM gear is common in punk fashion, just like harnesses and pup hoods are popular amongst furries. Furries have an odd relationship with porn and kink, but it's a very popular aspect of the fandom, and it fuels a lot of the creative energy and commerce. These aspects are arguably just as visible as the BDSM influence on punk. Both scenes are queer, kinky, and openly celebrate it. Compare these wearable BDSM-inspired outfits with 1980s fursuit pioneer Hilda the Bambioid. Furry was founded on this countercultural fashion statement.
With names like Bumbox, Scumbag, and Animal, you can imagine the very special aroma in here. But the cozy sleeping arrangements seem to have some advantages in their eyes.
While we're talking about fashion, we need to talk about the swastika. In the late 70s, punk rockers Sid Vicious and Susie Sue used the Nazi symbol for shock value. A big fuck you to cops and polite society at large. Most historical accounts peg this as an innocent gesture, and that these musicians are not in fact fascists. But it did get the attention of actual neo-Nazis. These outsiders would go on to hijack the skinhead look, forming their own racist bands and record labels. With the rebranding of neo-Nazis into the alt-right, hate groups started marketing themselves as alt-furry to recruit vulnerable furs. Andrew Anglin, founder of the neo-Nazi site The Daily Stormer, described alt-furry as a prime example of fascist activism. Punk and furry are highly tolerant communities. Hate groups try to exploit the paradox of tolerance, the idea that tolerance means putting up with bullying, bigotry, or violence as if those things are only a difference of opinion. But tolerance isn't a passive lack of standards. Tolerance means taking a stand when somebody claims that they have the right to mistreat you or your friends. Racist and fascist ideology is contradictory to the core ideals of punk and provoked an instant backlash at the co-opting of the culture. Punk gives us historical precedents to the tactics of Nazi recruiters, targeting large communities of disaffected white male youth looking to fit in, find a group, and a voice. Punk also shows us how to stomp it out and counter this poisonous culture. Nazi punks regularly raided punk shows, showing up to seek Heil, spew the N-word, be as offensive as possible, ignore mosh pit etiquette, and introducing physical violence, then playing the victim when they're shown the door. Punks vastly outnumbered neo-Nazis, and open clashes were rare. In the description, there's a GQ article about punk rocker anecdotes removing Nazis from their shows. People who claim to be the master race don't have a great track record of bravery. Authoritarianism is the antithesis of the inherently democratic movements like punk and furry. Furries have been doing the online and convention equivalent, making absolutely sure that Nazi furs know they're not welcome at our cons or our parties. Furries are doing it right by denying them a platform, mocking them, and avoiding violence. We fight by demanding decent behavior from each other and ostracizing hate group members with tools like the alt-furry blocker on Twitter. Link in the description if you're interested. I highly recommend it. This ugliness is not going away, but it was never not here. The real goal is to set a standard of behavior and to hold each other to it. Even if we successfully kicked out every alt-furry, the next batch of burned furs would just crop up again, rebranded, but keeping the same ignorant messages of hate. So instead of trying to play fascist whack-a-mole, we should simply strive for a higher standard of decency. These people won't all go away, but we can make sure that they know they're not welcome in the first place. Punk and furry challenge the assumptions and power imbalances of society. They posit that our value as people doesn't come from our bank accounts, but rather from our passion and our resourcefulness. They teach us that the self is an improvised work in progress, cobbled together with safety pins and workarounds. Nobody can confiscate your persona. Nobody can tell you how to rock. Whether through neon hair or rainbow fur, being defiantly different highlights our full range of possibility. Who we are, what we stand for, and how we're changing the world. Traditional society might be alarmed or threatened. They might try to commodify or co-opt it. But these are movements about the power of individuals, and individuals give them power. So be unconventional, be wild, be colorful, because nobody can do it like you can. What do you guys think? Is furry punk? What other lessons can furries learn from the punk scene? What other scenes out there can furry be compared to? Let us know down in the comments, and Rusty will respond to some of his favorites in the next Effed Up Date. We also managed to dig up this pamphlet about punk and furry distributed around California around 2012. We don't have any info about it, so if you know who made it or who distributed it, please let us know down in the comments. This video ended up spawning enough of a discussion about mainstream furry that we decided to break up the script into two parts. The second part, which will be out soon, will look at pop furry and the coming of the hot topic furries. After punk and nerd popularity, we get mashups like steampunk, fairy punk, and doom punk. We at Culturally have to want to define the furry aesthetic as fluff punk. So help support the show by purchasing one of our Fluff Punk merch items from our online store. Shipping is only $5 to the US. I've been your host Arrkay. Thanks for watching.
Hello, I am Rusty Sicklefur, Rusty's far superior Soviet cousin from Moscow. That culturally apt has set new standards for future videos. Make sure to support them by sharing these videos with all of your comrades. Sure, everyone wants to save Stalin's brain, but when you put it in a bear, suddenly that's going too far. Slowly but surely we are infiltrating the furry